This sweet little granny was actually a serial killer. She laid out the bodies of her victims in her bedroom and buried them in the backyard. In May 1988, the stench was noticeable in the neighborhood of Sacramento, California. That's when neighbors began to complain about the smell emanating from a boarding house owned by an elderly woman named Dorothea Puente, who rented rooms to the elderly and sick. She was a 59-year-old woman, Dorothea Helen Gray, born on January 9, 1929, in Reynolds, California. She was the daughter of Trudy Mae Jetz and Jesse James Gray, cotton pickers who often neglected and mistreated her during her childhood. Her father, an alcoholic, died of tuberculosis in 1937 when she was 8 years old. She was sent to an orphanage where she experienced abuse until relatives from Fresno, California, picked her up. Over the years, they noticed that Dorothea had a problem. She was a pathological liar who made up things all the time to get what she wanted, especially financially. In 1945, at 16, she married a soldier named Fred McCall with whom she had 3 children. But she didn't raise them. She sent the firstborn to live with relatives, gave the second one up for adoption, and miscarried the third pregnancy. Her husband, realizing her pathological lying, gradually pushed him away, and he left her in the same year. Due to unemployment, she began forging checks but was caught, leading to a 1-year prison sentence which she served 6 months before being released on parole. In the 1960s, Dorothea began having more legal troubles, including an arrest for running a brothel, resulting in a 90-day prison sentence in the Sacramento jail. Soon after, she was arrested again for vagrancy and sentenced to another 90 days. Upon release, she found work as a nursing assistant and caregiver for people with disabilities and the elderly. After managing pensions fraudulently, Dorothea Puente separated from her husband in 1966 after a failed 14-year marriage. She then married Roberto Puente, a man 19 years her junior, in Mexico City. The marriage lasted only 2 years, but she retained the Puente surname for the rest of her life. After divorcing, she moved to Sacramento, California. Dorothea Puente took charge of a 3-story house with 16 rooms on 2100 F Street. The house became a prosperous business, providing care for homeless and needy individuals. In 1976, she remarried Pedro Montt, an alcoholic and abusive man. After enduring mistreatment, she requested a divorce, finding herself alone once again. Spending time in bars seeking companionship, especially from older men and pensioners, she began falsifying the signatures of her patients to embezzle their money. Her fraudulent activities were detected by authorities, resulting in 34 charges of fraud and a prison sentence. Despite being granted parole, she continued forging signatures due to the magnitude of the work. Several weeks later, a 74-year-old pensioner named Malcolm McKenzie reported to the police that Dorothy had drugged and robbed him after a night at a local bar. He accused her of stealing a coin collection and forcefully taking a diamond ring. Dorothea was taken to court, found guilty of 3 counts of robbery, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. During her imprisonment, she falsely claimed responsibility for an attack on a fellow inmate, resulting in a transfer to protective custody. In January 1986, Dorothea Puente entered into a relationship with Iverson Wilmot, a 77-year-old retiree who used to send letters to female inmates. After serving 3 years in prison, she was released in September 1985, and Iverson greeted her in his 1980 Ford truck. Dorothea was delighted, and the relationship deepened, even discussing the possibility of marriage. However, a few days after her release, a strange event occurred. In November, Dorothea hired a man named Ismael Flores to do some work in the boarding house. She paid him $800 in her boyfriend's truck to install wooden panels. Later, she asked him to build an unusually sized box, 180 inches long, 90 inches wide, and 60 inches deep. On the way, Dorothea changed her mind and decided the box was trash, so she asked Ismael to throw it into a river in Sutter County. Days later, a fisherman discovered the box and alerted the police. Upon opening it, they found a severely decomposed body. Despite the discovery, Dorothea continued collecting Iverson's pension and wrote letters to his family explaining his absence due to health problems. Additionally, she kept checking her clients' mail and collecting their pensions, keeping more than half for personal expenses. In the following months, more mysterious disappearances of pension residents, including Betty Palmer and Carpenter, were reported. Martine, a 72-year-old woman, moved into the boarding house and was never seen again. Subsequently, Alvaro Bird Montoya, a 51-year-old schizophrenic known by many as El Jefe, the boss, arrived at the boarding house in February 1988, and months later, he also disappeared. When other tenants inquired about him, she told them he had gone to Mexico to visit his family. However, suspicions among neighbors arose after his disappearance. This individual had been coming to her house for some time, having meals there until he was eventually hired by the woman to perform various tasks in exchange for accommodation and maintenance. Neighbors noticed that El Jefe spent several months digging in the building's basement and transporting debris to a container with a wheelbarrow. Later, he built a small shed in the backyard, covering everything with a layer of concrete. Mysteriously, after this, he disappeared, and within a few days, complaints arose about the unpleasant odor emanating from the boarding house and a large number of flies. Dorothea Puente consistently justified the situation, claiming it was fish remains or some plumbing issue. Despite reports and inspections, authorities found nothing unusual, and the complaints were deemed unfounded. However, on November 7th, after reports that many people sent to Dorothea's boarding house had mysteriously disappeared, including Bert, the schizophrenic, these individuals were reported missing. When requested to enter the house, she complied without any issues, but nothing unusual was found. When officers observed the backyard, they noticed disturbed soil. They returned to the property with shovels, as the situation seemed suspicious. Then they encountered something they initially thought was a tree root. He pulled with force, revealing a bone. Seeing this, Dorothea Puente screamed, striking her face and appearing surprised and frightened by the discovery. On the following Saturday morning, a team of forensic anthropologists, officials from the coroner's office, and a county work crew equipped with heavy machinery arrived at the property. The first person they removed from the yard was the body of a small woman with gray hair and skeletal condition, identified as Leona Carpenter. As the team drilled through a concrete slab, Dorothea asked if she was under arrest. He said no, so she requested to go to the Clarion Hotel a few blocks away to have a cup of coffee, to which he agreed and let her go. Afterward, the team found 3 bodies under the concrete slab, and after a few days, they found 2 more in the side yard. Finally, after hours of work, by November 14th, the horrifying discovery would be 7 people buried in her boarding house. The bodies were severely deteriorated. The confirmed findings included Alvaro Worth Montoya, James Gallup, Vera Martin, and Betty Palmer, whose body had no head, hands, or even the lower part of the legs. The bodies of Leona Carpenter and Dorothy Miller, 64 years old, a woman with alcohol problems believed to have left the boarding house, were also found. She was found with her arms taped to her chest with duct tape. Benjamin Fink, 55 years old, whose issue was also alcohol, was also found. He was last seen in April 1988. The post-mortem examination of the 7 bodies found in the yard revealed high concentrations of the substance fluorocepa. Meanwhile, Dorothea walked to the Clarion Hotel, apparently to have a cup of coffee. However, once she arrived, she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. She disappeared from there, so the police initiated a statewide search and sought the FBI's help to locate her. Airports, bus stations, and train stations were checked without results. Later, it was discovered that she had left a false trail by booking a flight to Los Angeles and not taking the flight a few days later. John McCauley, 59 years old, was drinking in a bar in downtown Los Angeles when he suddenly saw an elegant woman with a red coat and sat next to her. She introduced herself as Donald Johansson, a woman from Sacramento whose husband had recently died. After finding out how much money he makes, she suggests they live together, claiming they are 2 lonely souls in the world and could keep each other company. After that, he took her to dinner, and they agreed to meet the next day. When McCauley returned to his apartment, he turned on the TV and discovered that the woman he had spent the day with was wanted by the police on suspicion of multiple murders. He called the local TV station, and the police and the journalist arrived at the Royal Viking Hotel at 10:20 at night and knocked on the door of room 31. Puente opened the door momentarily, blinded by the glare of television camera lights, and was immediately asked for some form of identification. With nowhere to go, Dorothea showed her driver's license, handed it to the detectives, and was quickly arrested when the authorities read her name on the license. Within hours, she was taken to the airport for her return to Sacramento. Upon arrival, she was booked into jail 7 minutes later, charged with murder. Finally, after months of preparation, the indictment was ready, and pre-trial hearings began on April 25, 1990. Dorothea Puente would be tried on 9 counts of murder. After a few years, once all the evidence had been examined, her trial began on February 9, 1993. However, it was not until July 15 of that year that, having heard 153 witnesses present 3,500 pages of evidence, the prosecution stated that Puente used sleeping pills to drug her tenants. Even more so with the knowledge that the prosecution was seeking the death penalty. On August 26, 1993, the jury reached a guilty verdict for the murder of Leona Carpenter, Dorothy Miller, and Benjamin Fink. Upon hearing the judge, he decided to declare a mistrial for the other 6 charges against her. On December 10, 1993, the judge pronounced the sentence, and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Upon hearing the verdict, she only smiled and claimed she had not murdered anyone. During her time in prison, she frequented the prison chapel, delved into John Grisham novels, and enjoyed watching TV. Remarkably, she authored a cookbook from behind bars titled Cooking with a Serial Killer. She was sent to the Central California Women's Prison and died in prison in 2011 at the age of 82 due to natural causes, without admitting her crimes. The press dubbed her house as the House of Death. Nowadays, the property has been opened as a museum for tourists. As part of the 2013 home tour hosted by the Sacramento Old City Association, the property at 1426 F Street gained prominence. It later took center stage in the 2015 documentary short The House is Innocent and, in conjunction with a local film festival's presentation of the film, opened its doors once again for tours on a specific day. What are your thoughts on the story? What motivated Dorothea Puente to commit the crimes described in the story? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow for more crime stories.